I think that cables are probably the most recognizable of all the hand manipulated stitches that you can work on a knitting machine, and it's usually one of the very first things that people try. All you need initially is the set of transfer tools that came with your machine, so that you have a pair of 2x2 or a pair of 3x3 tools. And as I usually recommend, we're going to start with 2x2 cables. I usually cross cables by hooking on both tools, keeping my fingers back against the fabric so that I have some resistance to the stitches splitting. And then I'll move the 2 stitches from the right over to the left. Keep your finger right up under there so that the stitches transfer cleanly. And then the 2 from the left over to the right. And when I deposit the second set of stitches, I always pull the needles right out to holding position to assure that the needles knit cleanly when I knit the first row. Okay, so I worked 4 rows because this was a 2/2 cable. And if you find that handling the 2 tools is a little bit tricky for you initially, here's what I'd suggest. Remove the 2 stitches from the left and then just hook that tool onto the next 2 needles at left. Don't transfer the stitches off. We're just using it as kind of a holding position. And then I'm going to use a second tool to remove the 2 from the left, from the right, and move them over to the left. And then I can unhook this tool, the stitches are still intact on the prongs, and transfer the 2 left stitches onto the right. And once again, I'll knit 4 rows. Now, you don't see a lot from the back, but you can see where the crossings are. And one of the things you need to know is that you can affect the width of the cable, not just by varying the number of stitches, which we'll do, but also by working more rows in between. If instead of 4 rows, I knit 8 before I cross the next cable, you're going to find when you look at the finished example that the cable appears wider where I allowed more rows in between crossings. And that's a really good trick for adding a little more variety to the cables as you knit them. So once again, I'll go back to 4 rows in between. And I think you can see right here that where there were 4 rows in between crossings, the cable appears a bit narrower. And where I allowed more rows in between, the cable is wider. I think in terms of stitch recovery, whenever I do any kind of manipulations, how long it takes for the stitches to fall back into their original position, which is exactly what we're seeing here. Now, a 3x3 cable is going to be a little bit trickier to cross. And again, I would probably try moving these 3 stitches over if you can, letting the adjacent needles hold on to the tool, and then move the 3 from the right. And you're going to see a lot more tension on the needles here. This may or may not cross for me, we'll see. But I can guarantee you that the fastest way to knit cables is slowly and deliberately. Now this is going to be probably too tight to knit, but and tight to cross. We'll deal with loosening these things up in another session. But I want you to see that if I bring all the needles out to holding position, it's definitely going to help the needles knit more cleanly and hopefully to knit even a cable this tight. But a better position than holding position is upper work position, which is back about here. And this generally will allow these needles to knit without hooking on each other and getting stuck. Let's see what happens. I went with 8 rows in between there. 6 probably would have been okay as well. Let's see if I can handle both of the tools at once without even relying on the left-hand needle. Again, this is going to be a tight one, so work slowly and deliberately. And again, when the needles are out here in holding position, these two are kissing. And you run the risk of them crossing and hooking onto each other as the carriage knits across. But when I push them back to upper work position, I've got a good maybe 1/4 to 1/3 of an inch free between those needles. And it knits quite easily. And because there are 6 stitches involved rather than 4, we can tell even from the back of the fabric that the cable is going to look a whole lot wider. And the same thing holds true here. With fewer rows between crossings, the cable will be somewhat constricted. With more rows, the cable will be able to achieve its full width because the stitches will have space to recover. Now, if you couldn't get that 3x3 to cross, I'm using a nice stretchy wool here, but if you had a cotton or a yarn that wouldn't cross for you, there's another way we could approach this. If I use a 3-prong tool and a 2-prong tool, I'm going to take the 2 stitches off first, hold it to the side, and then I'm going to move the 3 stitches to the left and then cross the 2. This is going to put a whole lot less strain on the needles and on the fabric, and will give you almost the same effect on the front of the fabric. So once again, I'm removing the 2 stitches here on the left and the 3 on the right, crossing the 3 first because the simple rule, particularly with cables, whichever stitches are on the needles first will show on the knit side of the fabric. And in this case, I want the cable to look as wide as possible, so I'm putting the 3 stitches to the front and the 2 will cross behind. Always keep that in mind. What's ever on the needles first is what shows on the knit face of the fabric. And there you have it. It's still a good wide cable, and it's certainly wider than the 2x2 was. So we've got here a 2x2 cable right there, a 3x2, and a 3x3. And while we're at it, we could also look for a somewhat different cable defect if instead of 2x3, if I only do, say, a 1x3, so I'm taking 1 stitch off and then the 3, and in this case I'm crossing the 1 stitch first because I want that to show on the front. I don't want a traditional cable here. And then the 3 behind. And once again, let's see how this looks. The face stitch, the knit side stitch goes first, so in this case it's the 1, and then the 3 cross behind. And you've got a little more decorative effect. You have the single enlarged stitch running in front of the other 3, and it looks enlarged because in fact it's been stretched. So what we never want to do is get to the point where there's no cross tension on the stitches by having such loose stitches that the cables don't have any oomph for them. They need to be able to sort of pucker up on the surface of the fabric, and that requires some tension on the stitches. I sometimes rely on crossing cables right on the edge of a scarf or a shawl because it produces a mostly non-roll edging. And I'm saying mostly non-roll because a lot of it has to do with the yarn that you're using and how it responds to steaming or washing or general finishing. But I'm going to cross the 3 from the right over to the left just like before. Let's move that out of the way. And then the 3 from the left over to the right. And they don't look as tight here because not having any stitches beyond those first 3 removes any of the extra strain. And if I lost my place, I could come back to this fabric and say, okay, the last stitches that went down were the ones that crossed to the right because I can see them lying on top of the others. So you can always read one cable off of another to see where you're heading. So once again, the 3 from the edge are moving in, and the 3 from the left are moving out towards the edge. And you could do this the opposite way if you wanted to. You could cross the inner stitches out and then the outer stitches in. Just be consistent. I'm not going to change this halfway through, but either way is fine. And it doesn't seem to affect whether or not the edge is non-roll. And there you have it. And there's always going to be a little bit of a gap here. You sometimes see it even in hand knits. And I'll tell you that the wider the cable, the more stitches you're using, the larger that gap is apt to be. And again, in some future lessons, I'll show you some things you can do to minimize that effect. Okay, now if I were crossing some 2x2 cables and I wanted to help them stand out even more from the surface of the fabric, I might decide to go back every 10 or 15 rows and latch up some stitches. And I sometimes latch up just so that it's a purl stitch on the other side, which means a knit stitch on this side. And sometimes I latch up and tuck, and I want you to see that. If I latch up with a regular purl stitch alongside this cable, it is in effect a rib stitch, and rib tends to pull fabric in. Well, cables already tend to pull the fabrics in. So be prepared that you may need to add some extra stitches to your sweater to accommodate that pulling in. I always insert the tool first, give a little downward tug, and then drop it from the adjacent needle there and latch up alongside the cable. So some people allow, 2 extra stitches in the overall dimension of a garment to make up for each cable. You will experience some pulling in, and that may not be a bad idea. The best idea is to include cables in the swatch that you use for determining your gauge. So let's see, we've got a latched up stitch on one side, and I'll be able to tug on this afterwards to close up that stitch a little. It's kind of distended. But I think you can see alongside that it creates a definite channel that we don't have on this side. On this side, I'm going to show you what it looks like if I latch up and tuck. So once again, I'll drop my stitch down onto my latch tool. In this case, you can tell I'm using one of the wooden handled latch tools that I find so comfortable and that I have on the website for you. So I'm going to pass the hook of the tool under 2 bars of the ladder, but only grab the first one in the hook. So I'm pulling that bar underneath this one and through the stitch that was on the tool. You can see there it's forming a tuck. So again, I'll pass the tool under 2, but only take 1. Under 2, and just grab the second one. And I would never let this go to the very end of a garment. I usually do my latching up, every 10, 20 rows max. So otherwise you're way down on the floor and it's too difficult to manipulate and you'll never get it even. So right here on the back, we can see the difference between the latched up knit stitch here or the tuck stitch next to it. And when you look at the front of the garment, it's a much more decorative effect alongside the cable, but it also has the advantage because tuck stitch tends to naturally spread sideways. Latching up and tuck alongside a cable puts back some of the width that the cable takes away. So if I were doing a lot of cables on a sweater that needed to be size large, this is probably the way that I would latch up to avoid pulling in the garment anymore.